Welcome to Aspire, an I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. It is awesome to be back with the team. Gabriel, Hugh, excellent to be with you. Thanks for your time on another weekend. And today I'd also like to introduce someone who's been behind the scenes with our org, helping us get the podcast in professional shape. And I'm so pleased to introduce the newest member of the I Have the Right To team, Ben Hudak. Ben, can you just give us a little bit of self-introduction?
How's it going? Yeah, thanks, Alex, and nice to meet all of you formally. I'm Ben. I like to play with audio and sound, and been helping run the podcast smoothly, recording things, editing it behind the scenes.
I have to say, the way the universe has worked for I Have the Right To has been always to put unbelievable people in our paths when we need to meet those people. That's how I came across Hugh and Gabriel at a summit on sexual assault and consent almost 2 years ago. And that was again the case when we were struggling to get this podcast put together. And an angel within our org introduced us to Ben. And amusingly, Ben had to work with a backlog of pre-taped episodes. And one of the first times we actually sort of met via Zoom, Ben had the benefit of listening to multiple episodes. And it was an amusing conversation because it was like Ben knew us deeply through listening to, probably 10, 15 hours of podcasts. So he had an unfair advantage on us.
Oh, yeah. I felt like I was talking to celebrities. It was kind of a crazy experience.
Well, it opened up an amazing first conversation that I was able to have with Ben because in many ways he felt like he knew us, and I also had an instinctive feeling that this young man was an excellent young man and was going to be a good friend going forward. So anyway, very happy to have you helping with the podcast, but also joining us in the conversation today.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Happy to be here.
So this is probably a very good conversation, Ben, for you to join us in because your background is technology. And we want to talk today about technology, which can be a wonderful thing, but can also put some impediments out there for us that we as human beings need to adjust to, especially when it comes to the context of who we identify as and how we want to present ourselves to the world. Because now technology has become one of our primary sources of connectivity with other people. And I'd love to dive into this. We're also coming off of a 2-week road trip for I Have the Right To and several members of our team up and down the East Coast, meeting with schools across the Northeast, which included the Riverdale School in the Bronx, New York, where Hugh and Gabriel go to school. So we'd love to dive into a little bit of the reflections on that school visit. We spent 2 days there at Riverdale meeting with a small group of student leaders, including Hugh and Gabriel. And then we spoke to the upper school about transitions and the importance of knowing who you are and able to handle all the responsibilities that come from transitioning from high school to university. So on that note, gentlemen, love to hear your thoughts on our recent visit to your school.
Well, I can speak first. I would say that, first of all, I would like to commend Alex and the team for speaking at Riverdale because I think every piece of feedback that I received from that visit was positive. And it was just so amazing to hear how impacted people were by Alex's story, as well as this new form of masculinity that was being presented to them. I think that a lot of people hadn't heard it before, had never been exposed to what we call aspirational masculinity. And I just thought it was very inspiring to hear such positive feedback, and I think we're going in the right direction, and I really see us making a change in the world through this work.
Yeah, Riverdale is taking a great first step into really teaching us more about consent and aspirational masculinity, but I think we can really dive deeper and have more conversations around this topic and kind of have curriculum that also includes books on this topic like Beartown and kind of more intertwine it within the curriculum. But I do think that coming from these talks and after Alex was speaking to all of us, it really gave not only me, but I know a lot of my other fellow classmates and peers more deeper insight into what aspirational masculinity is and to really see more than just that one narrow viewpoint of it. And I think really having this more of a wider sense really makes people more engaged in the topic and also interested, because I know, at least for me, I had a lot of my friends and peers come up to me after and ask how they can further engage in this topic and learn more about it and help in it, because I think they realize that this topic is so important and they just weren't actually acquainted with this topic as much, even though it was a part of their life so much. They just didn't understand it fully. But after this talk, they really understood it more and they wanted to further engage and learn how they can actually switch this whole narrative in their life.
So if I can ask you guys a question, because you've had the advantage of diving into this work for the past 18 months in terms of exploring what is aspirational masculinity versus socially constructed masculinity. What does it mean to connect with and identify with your wholeness in terms of the full range of what is within you? Can you tell me what the experience was like now sitting in an audience, hearing me speak while your peers are most likely earlier in that, journey? What were some of your thoughts and reflections during it, listening to the talk? Were there things that were like clearer to you? Were there things that were touching you more deeply or on a different level?
Well, I think the fact that I've heard your story every time I hear it again makes it even more impactful, and I feel like there's more detail that gets added to it, and I feel in a way through this work very connected to that story and to preventing sexual assault from happening, because it really starts with us and with our conversations about masculinity. I would also like to highlight the contrast between people entering the visit and people after the visit. So I think that a lot of people came up to me before, and people who knew I was involved with I Have the Right To came up and said, are you going to this talk? Like, what's it going to be about? I've never, I don't know, should I go? Should I not? And in some ways, some people were not necessarily critical, but hesitant to attend the meeting. But then afterwards, obviously, like Gabriel mentioned, it was only positive feedback. So I think another goal we're trying to achieve through this is that first stigma around the topic, because we want to make this a normal topic, and we want to make this a topic that people can talk freely about and not be held back by like these barriers. Am I supposed to go to this as like a quote unquote real man? So I think that's interesting to see.
And I think for me, one of the main takeaways I had, it was just remembering how I felt when you first spoke to me, Alex, and when I first attended one of your workshops, and then remembering how I felt from that, and then seeing the same look on my other peers' faces and seeing how it's impacting them and seeing how they're like internally their mind and the way they're thinking is changing, and seeing how powerful what you're saying is, and just knowing how that one speech and that one workshop can really change so many people's perspectives, and it can really lead to much further change and much more tangible change, rather than just thinking you want to do something, but it actually happening and you really making that deep change.
So, wow. Hugh, you said a word that I'm struggling with right now in in a pretty powerful way. You use the word stigma, and that is such a powerful word, right? Because I think, I don't know if other people feel this way. When I say or think of the word stigma, I sort of begin to shrink as a human being. I feel this like heavy weight coming over me, right? That's like forcing me down and containing me and preventing me from being who I am, right? And feeling this heaviness, this shame, this embarrassment, very negative feelings, right? And I'm so glad you used that word, and it's so interesting to me you use it in the context of young men feeling this in before hearing this talk, right? Like this, just the thought of talking about masculinity and this ethereal phrase, aspirational masculinity, they could feel a stigma before even turning up that might prevent them from coming, right? And this is something so important, I think, for all of us to reflect upon. And Ben, I'll turn it over to you in a second because I'd love to get your thoughts on that word, right? But I realize now I felt that heavy coat of my wife sleeps with one of these weighted blankets, so I'm almost picturing one of these really heavy 30-pound weighted blankets that's like over me, just holding me down, not allowing me to be myself, and having freedom of movement, freedom to feel, freedom to do anything. And I realize now that's how I've felt my whole life, that I've been carrying around this heavy frickin' blanket that's prevented me from being the beautiful, wonderful person that I really think exists inside of me. And the beauty of the trauma that my daughter faced and the trauma that our family faced 10 years ago has been unleashing me from that feeling of stigma, right? Because I was forced to shed all the BS that was around me in order for me to do my role of being a good man, a good father, a good husband to the people that I cared most about in the world. And that has been such a liberating experience for me that I feel obligated to share it with other young men, because guess what? I understand what you guys are all carrying around with you. And you don't deserve it. You don't deserve it. You guys deserve to live life as you can embrace it with every quality that you have. So I'm gonna pause there before I get too wrapped up. But Ben, tell me what you're thinking
About the word stigma. Yeah, I always thought it was kind of a weird word that maybe I don't understand entirely. It seems like it's like going against a norm, right? And I've never particularly been somebody who enjoys following norms. I've always, tried to seek out how I can be as weird as possible. I think after school, but especially after high school in particular, the idea of talking about things that people aren't used to talking about and making people, maybe uncomfortable or throwing them off actually just leads to interesting conversations, right? Like, I guess I'm thinking of mental health. People talk about the stigma of mental health. And yeah, maybe in high school it was weird for a guy to say he's depressed, right? Because, well, you're depressed now, you're just sad. Actually, I think somebody told me that once. They said, "You're not depressed, you're just sad." I was like 14. But now having these conversations, and I remember Alex when we talked the first time, we talked about mental health, and we actually had a really open conversation and talked about things that I wouldn't even talk about with my friends back in high school. And it just led to a great conversation. What I hope you would agree is a friendship, and also some professional work, right? So only good things have come from talking about a topic that many people would consider a stigma.
So what are the kind of things that are when when we say the word stigma, for each one of you individually, what is it? What is the first feeling or thing that comes to mind?
Well, I think for me, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in this podcast is the idea of armor. And when you say this word stigma, it's like you want to add another layer of armor to really protect yourself from it and kind of reinforce this stigma. But when we first talk about it and when people first encounter with this topic and we talk about it, that first layer of armor just really breaks away and you really are able to dive deep into someone's like wholeness rather than just staying on the outside and always really deflecting off any of these topics because you have this outside external armor that you always keep on because you really want to control and prevent any way of breaking the stigma, and you just want to keep yourself as a stoic emotionless man because you never want to feel any of these internal emotions because the stigma that of masculinity was that you're never allowed to feel any of these emotions. So you never thought that you could. So you always had this armor on. But when you first have these topics about masculinity and aspirational masculinity and consent, you learn that it truly is okay to have all of the emotions, and you learn to slowly break away your armor, as we've talked about in this podcast. And as the conversations continue, because it's not just one conversation that completely changes your whole narrative. Sadly, that's not possible. It's a kind of continuous progress and continuous pattern. And when you continually have these conversations, it slowly breaks away this armor and you get fully into your wholeness and into your core of who you truly are. So I think with these continual conversations, it's how you can really break away the stigma.
Gabriel, you reminded me of a conversation I had over the weekend that I actually wanted to bring up with you guys because I thought it was just so funny. But I went to a meetup downtown, and then there's this one guy who was there, and he was, and of age, extremely drunk, just absolutely beyond the point that would not be embarrassing, and he just said something so profound in that state that it just stuck with me. But completely out of the blue, completely off topic, he just said, many people think being a man means remaining stoic, but I've given it a lot of thought, and he's slurring his speech, but I've given it a lot of thought, and I've decided that being a man means feeling every single one of those feelings, and then maybe still remaining tough and intact and emotionally secure. Where did that come from? Oh my gosh. Like that's so wise. And we talk about you guys talk about on the podcast a lot about feeling your feelings and crying as a guy. And yeah, of course. But also maybe there is something to say about feeling those feelings and in certain situations also remaining stoic.
Well, I think this is something we've actually talked a lot about in our programming at schools, and something I've added in just this year based on a conversation with another group of young men that I work with in Washington, D.C. And one of the young men, when we were talking about that full range of emotions of being a man, right, from the real man qualities of being tough, strong, dominant, etc., assertive, to the softer side of being a man, being vulnerable, being sensitive, being emotional, these things represent the full range of who we are as human beings, right? Regardless of your gender or identity. And the harder thing is, depending on where you identify on that spectrum, is the talent or the ability to use a dial to understand, how am I going to be in a particular situation? Where does it call for that assertiveness? Because I think anyone at different moments in time wants to be assertive. And then there are other times where you need to show that sort of empathetic, listening, understanding side of you, right? And I think for men, we're so attuned to being in that stoic, assertive, unemotional, strong, side, right? That dial gets stuck there. And I find it interesting that the person you met had to lubricate quite a bit in order to be more expressive, right? And that's something that I naturally felt for, because obviously what he's saying is coming from, a central place in his identity, but it took him the effort of self and, lubricating, being inebriated to allow himself to express that emotion. And, Ben, you are, a little bit older than Hugh and Gabriel. You're in your mid-20s right
Yeah.
now.
25.
Right smack in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
Listening to that with that mid-20s reaction, I'd love to sort of hear, Hugh and Gabriel, your reaction as 17-year-olds, how you react to hearing what Ben just said.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to the idea that, we can express all of these emotions and we have them inside of us, yet things are preventing us. And it's interesting, obviously, that this man was drunk, like Alex said, to express these emotions, but we want to create a culture where you don't have to be drunk to express yourself in any way. And we want everybody to be themselves no matter what. And I think related to that, I actually looked up the origin of the word stigma, and it comes from like the Greek and Latin word meaning like a mark, a dot, or a puncture. And I think that relates back to like people thinking that doing one thing will give them a permanent mark or a puncture in like what Gabriel was talking about, their armor. But that's not the reality of it. And that's something that we want to show to everyone. We don't want this stigma, this fear of being marked with like a certain feeling or association. We don't want that holding people back. And so I think that's something that we can explore more. And I think that Ben's story really highlights that, but also gives a new perspective in the way that people do have these emotions, yet they're too afraid to express them in like, I guess, a sober context in this, or in a sober way in this context. And, I think that we're just trying to break that stigma and that fear of being marked.
So adding on to that, I think also with this idea of being stoic, often people think that's really not showing any emotions or even not feeling any emotions. So I think it's important for our listeners to really differentiate between being able to feel your emotions and not showing your emotions, because I think often people think being stoic is not feeling any of your emotions. So I think it's more about actually feeling your emotions, because I think for some people it's going to be hard for them to be this stoic person but feel their emotions at the same time. So I think first, people should learn to feel your emotions, and that should be your number one priority, because that's how you can really understand yourself and understand what you're feeling. And after you feel all of your emotions, then you can decide internally if you want to show those emotions. But being able to feel those emotions is what should really come first, rather than just rather than just thinking of what you want to portray to the outside world of what you want to show. But rather you should instead focus on feeling all of your emotions and then going on into the external appearance.
And I think related to that, like when we talk about aspirational masculinity and socially constructed masculinity, and we've done activities where we have like a man box where people list all their emotion, or not emotions, but all the things that they associate with a quote unquote real man into a box. We don't necessarily want to split them into different categories. We want to say that, men can feel this range of emotions. We don't want people to think that in some ways they can't be stoic, because maybe that in some ways can help you in a certain situation. We just want to make sure that people are able to feel every emotion and to express themselves without a barrier. And I think that's something that people came up and talked to me after, but I kind of explained that and explained to them that it's not necessarily a category that aspirational masculinity or socially constructed masculinity is trying to put you in. Aspirational masculinity is trying to make sure that you can feel everything you want to feel.
So I love the fact, Hugh, that you gave the definition, that sort of precise definition of stigma, right? A mark, a dot, a puncture, because it does infer a wound, some damage done. And but when you said those words under the context of aspirational masculinity, what I pictured was a pressure release. I pictured like a bulging, as human beings, and I see you guys as young, all three of you as young men, you're filled with so much potential, so much capability, so much a range of emotions, and you're continuing to grow. I think all of us are continuing to grow until we're no longer here. You think of, all of these things that live within a shell, they have the ability at some point in their life to shed the shell, right? And grow on another one that is bigger, that they can grow into. And as human beings, as men especially, we're fitted with that tight armor. And as you guys mentioned, that armor gets heavier and heavier as you get older, the expectations. And unless we find ways to puncture that armor and relieve some of that pressure, we're going to suffocate inside of that shell. So I think it's our duty to find ways to puncture that shell with as many holes as possible. So then we can release and then focus on growing anew. I think we all know that protective shells do have their purpose, right? But if they become limiting in terms of our ability to function from not only just a baseline, but then to thrive as a human being, we need to shed that shell, right? I mean, that's it. I just love that new images come into my mind, on this, right? Because I feel in so many ways our young people are held back from their full potential by the expectations that society puts on them.
Yeah, and as you just said that, Alex, that visualization, I just thought of another visualization. I think when we're talking about stigma as this kind of puncture, let's say it's this wound, and you get punctured with the wound of the stigma, and socially constructed masculinity, which so many young men experience, is just kind of covering the wound with your hand. You're not really doing anything to fix it. It's still there, but you're just covering it. So it's still there internally, but you're acting like it's not. But when you really teach and learn about aspirational masculinity, that's really fixing the wound and taking it away and mending it and continually working up until it doesn't exist anymore, rather than socially constructed, which is just kind of covering it while it's still there, but you're pretending it's not. But I think one of the main aspects of this aspirational masculinity is really acknowledging the stigma that's there, not pretending like it's not there, but acknowledging that it is there and knowing how can we work to fix the stigma. Because I think many people with this socially constructed masculinity mindset, they think that they just kind of push this idea back and ignore it and just say, oh, it's just how I am. There's no way I can fix it, and ignore it and say, it's not my problem. I'll leave it to the next person. But aspirational masculinity and this whole mindset is really being the leader and really taking initiative to make this change, to really fix this stigma, instead of being this passive person, just letting it hurt other people and letting even worse things happen, like sexual assault or like rape, these really major devastating things that can happen to people if you're just this passive person looking on, being a bystander instead of that upstander, instead of that leader, which we all want to strive to be.
Wow. So also on this 2-week trip, meeting with schools in the Boston and New York area, we talked a lot about consent, and I'm going to link these two definitions together, right? So stigma is a mark, a dot, a puncture, and we've just had a pretty interesting conversation about, the positive impact of a puncture, right, in someone who's being sort of self-contained in this pressure chamber. And the pressure chamber is meant to contain feelings, right? So during these visits with schools over the past 2 weeks, we've had a lot of conversations about consent, and there are a lot of working definitions of consent with acronyms like FRIES, Hot Spice, FKGIA. They're all clever ways to come up with words about how to define consent as being based on honesty, on openness, on communication, etc., that it's changeable. But I said to especially the young men, the way to boil it down is to go to the Latin roots of consent, which means con, with, and sentire, to feel. And so feel with. And to feel with someone, you have to be in a trusting relationship. You have to have good communication. You have to do both verbal and nonverbal communication because that involves feelings. It infers a lot of respect, etc. But if young men are building armor to contain their feelings, it terrifies me from just a structural perspective of men's ability to understand the concept of consent, because they're trying to deny their feelings because there's a stigma attached to having those feelings. And that's such an inherent part of being a human being, right? Is to feel. And consent at its foundational element is to feel with someone. If you are hiding your own feelings, how then can you freely share it with someone else? And so would love to get your reactions in terms of just your fundamental feeling about relationships with anyone. It doesn't need to be with a romantic relationship. It can be with, a friend, to feel with someone. How do you guys feel about even friendship with non-romantic friends?
Well, I think for me, I really thought of this comparison as the idea of to love someone else, to really be able to love someone else, you have to love yourself first. So I think that really goes along with the idea is if you're denying your own emotions, then you're going to deny someone else's emotions. And you're saying, oh, I can't feel sad, or I obviously would want this. So why wouldn't someone else want this? So when you initially deny yourself these emotions, then that kind of leads into hurting other people and denying other people's emotions. But instead, I think it really comes from you have to recognize your own self first and be able to acknowledge those feelings. And when you can do that, then you can really be a positive impact on others and be able to help others and be a positive outlook for people instead of this kind of negative person who is harming others because you are harming yourself first.
I also think, going back to the roots of the word consent, like con, with, and sent, to feel, feel with. I think that when people are taught not to feel anything, and when people are taught to be stoic by society, and when people are taught to embrace socially constructed masculinity, there's no form of, this is what really causes sexual assault and violations of consent, because there's no form of feeling. And like Gabriel was saying, if you don't love yourself, how can you love someone else? I think that, if you can't feel anything as yourself, if you're constantly stoic and you have this mindset where, I have to act in a certain way, I can't feel any of my emotions, how are you going to recognize when somebody else feels certain emotions and when somebody else feels violated in their bodily autonomy or in their own feelings? So I think that's an important point to make. This work isn't just trying to make men feel their whole range of emotions. That's a big part of it, but also making sure that that reflects in a positive way and that allows other people or inspires other people to be able to connect with them and to feel these emotions with them.
Also, I would say going back to this idea of education that we talked about earlier, I know often if we're reading a book in school or watching a movie in school and some scene comes up where consent's not given or not asked for, but the action goes through and it turns out positive, then that really, and I think that idea is really in that scene where consent's not given is actually very common in different books and different movies, and I think across media around the world, which really puts this negative narrative and negative frame on people because they think, oh, it's not cool to ask for consent, when in reality it actually is, and it's always, you should always ask for consent no matter what. And I think by reading these books or watching these movies in school where consent's not given, but it actually may turn out okay, that really enforces this narrative of the not needing to ask for consent. But in reality, I think it's really important for schools to focus and teach books that have examples of the importance of consent and when consent is freely given and the success of it and why it's so important, rather than constantly reinforcing the negative narrative of not giving consent and in this kind of romanticizing it per se.
So how can we activate young people, specifically young men, to understand the beauty that exists within, right? That, that they're filled with love, that they're filled with caring, that they're filled with all of these emotions and capabilities and potential. And we've acknowledged, right, and talked about how society keeps that contained. How do we activate young people to start letting this out in safe and appropriate ways?
Well, I think, at least from my own experience, especially as a boy or as a young man, it's harder to experience vulnerability and this range of emotions when you're in a group of people. I think I've had experiences where I've been, one-on-one with somebody or even in a very small group talking about my own vulnerability and these emotions I've had. Yet I think that, like we talked about, there's a certain stigma when it's in a group setting. So I think what I would encourage boys and young men to do is to reach out to somebody that they feel that they can trust and talk to or feel with, like we've been talking about. And almost 100% of the time, no one's going to shut you down if you're one-on-one or make fun of you. Because I think that the reaction of, making fun of somebody for feeling a certain way or doing something comes in a group setting and in a setting of insecurity. So I think that what my main tip would be is that I think it does start one-on-one, and that's something that I would encourage kids to do.
I would also say so many times the real way that this conversation can be started is really not pushing, but let's say diving deeper and not just letting it end. Let's say I ask you, Alex, hey, how are you doing? And you just respond, good. Because for me, I would say good. I'm doing good no matter what. That is my basic response. Even if I'm having the worst day of my life, you ask me, some random person asks me, how am I doing? Good. That's just good. I'm always good. And instead, I think a friend, or if you really want to have that deep conversation, you ask, how are you really doing? To really dive deep, to see how they're actually doing, not this fake facade and, hey, I'm doing good. But actually, are you actually doing good, or what's actually happening in your life? And actually diving deeper, talking about what's happening, what's going on in your life, why are you feeling this way? And acknowledging that it is okay to feel this way, because I bet you the feelings that you're feeling, the other person has also felt many times before. And it's not, these emotions are not only for you, they're felt by everyone. And you don't have to feel like it's only felt by you, because a range of emotions is felt by almost everyone. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that and not really just let it sit on the surface, but know that if you want to have these conversations, you really have to dive deep, and you can't just let it stop at, hey, I'm good, and let it sit for there. You have to really dive deep and say, are you actually good? I think that's the one really important thing to think about for everyone.
Yeah, but as Hugh said, that conversation probably has to happen with a trust with one person, or in a smaller setting with someone that a level of trust exists. But what I find it interesting is that, Hugh, you said in a larger group that might be more difficult. Likely result is, some fun being made of you if you sort of opened up and showed some vulnerability. And if we think about it clinically, that how ass backwards this is, right? That someone like, I'll take an extreme, and Andrew Tate can stand up there and say a real man is someone who carries a sword and, slays dragons and defends weak women who should swoon for them, right? And be grateful for that protection. And actually that's ridiculous. That's the kind of statement that should be made fun of. Yet if he says it in forums where there's hundreds, thousands, millions of followers or people listening who are all roaring and nodding and saying yes, and that to me is like ridiculous and should be shamed and is a disgrace and a stigma should be felt, versus someone who can stand up in a room like Steve Peacock, our board member, and talk about his trauma and what happened to him and how it impacted his life and how much courage and bravery that takes to show that level of vulnerability that can really connect with people in a meaningful way. And, we do have our work set out, which is, I'm so grateful to have these, conversations. And the reality is, I get to go and speak at these schools, but you are living on the front lines, within these schools, within these ecosystems where speaking up and doing the work that you're doing is incredibly difficult. And, Ben, you've just exited from, that world. You've picked up and, like you said, you managed to your own drumbeat, right? And you've moved overseas to live your best, life. As someone who has just sort of exited, the social structures of education and all the pressures there. I mean, what are you feeling and thinking through this sort of dialogue?
Yeah, well, I have to say I had a great experience at college, and I'm lucky enough to not. eh, Honestly, yeah, I'm super lucky. I had a great time, and I learned a lot. It's very expensive, and I'll be paying that off for a while. But I definitely think that it gave me the confidence and the connections and like the know-how to do what we're doing now, right? But yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't really like doing things the way they're supposed to be done. So I thought that it would be fun to travel around a little bit, pick the city I like the best, and then figure out how to stay here. And it took some time, and it took a lot of crying and stress and anxiety, but it
Yeah,
worked
I'm
out.
I'm glad you said that, Ben, because you're beginning to make it sound like it was easy, it was natural, and you and I have talked a little bit about like your professional journey and some of you know, the times that you've been like standing on a ledge and saying, I think I want to do this, but it seems like a big risk. And, but it sounds like, you've made some very conscious decisions at different points in your life where you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't know what you're going to be facing. But it also sounds to me like eventually and this is the way that I feel, that eventually you find your people, right? And I think the hardest thing to understand, especially as younger people, is to think the people that are around you now are your people. And it's safe. You feel like you belong. You're not taking any risks. And you're feeling like there are no other people out there like you. So you'll suppress, who you are in order to have that feeling of belonging. And actually the power of this universe is there's so many different people with different ways of thinking. The hardest thing really is to have the courage to just go out and find your people and let that be sort of a natural sort of kinetic energy out there by you taking that risk to find what you truly love to do with people that you can be yourself with. That example sets out, in my belief, kinetic energy to the rest of the universe that people will follow. Because I don't think we have enough examples of people who've had the bravery to do, for example, what the three of you have done in different decisions, right? to do certain things in your life, in your young lives to date. And I actually applaud and commend you guys for that.
So, Alex, one of the toughest things for me has been when I think that I have found one of my people, and then I learned the hard way that I didn't, and that they're not. So, I mean, to be fair, it's only happened maybe twice, maybe twice in my life, I think. But how do you stay motivated, and how do you get past that? How do you remind yourself that you just got to keep looking?
Well, I'm going to throw it right back at you. So, what did you feel when you found that person or thing?
At first, I felt like, I don't know, maybe a sense of purpose. Maybe these people will, yeah, whether professionally or like socially or within a society or something, these people have provided me with some sort of sense of purpose.
And how did that make you feel?
Great, fulfilled.
Right?
Yeah.
And where on the spectrum of our slide on socially constructed masculinity or, aspirational masculinity, I would imagine you're feeling a lot more things that, and again, if we think of things as like a dial, you probably were, forced to dial into more the feelings of connectivity, of empathy, of sensitivity, of, all these things that connect us as human beings. And the one thing I can tell you, as at 50 years old, I had to shed a lot of stuff. And my life is so much better for it now, despite everything that has happened to my daughters, to our family. All of us in the family can say we're better for it because we are filled with love that every day, all I want to do is share it. And you talked about this sense of purpose. I'm feeling like I was able to puncture this pressurized balloon that allowed me to express my love to everybody and not be ashamed of it, not be scared of it, not to feel like I have to hide because of it. And I've got a smile on my face now talking about topics that I could not imagine talking about 25 years ago, even when I had 3 beautiful young daughters and looking at them wanting the best for them. I was still held back by my socially constructed masculinity. And now working with you and Gabriel, you guys closely, and seeing your growth and your desire to change the world inspires me and gives me more gasoline to keep this effort going. Because we need more of this in the world, guys. And I can tell you, I know so many men my age that want to escape from it, right? But it was only through the trauma that my family went through that it was like having a car accident where it took a massive, collision, right, to penetrate the armor that it built up. And, those things you don't always survive, right? It's, and that's why I feel so blessed right now, right? Because we got through something that many people don't. And I think we need to soften up the world to make sure that other people, they don't take a near catastrophic collision to be able to shed, their armor. Because that's sad. And not everyone makes it through.
And I think just it doesn't have to take, like as Alex said, a major catastrophic event in your life for this change to happen. It can just really be these daily conversations that happen. And in my own experience, I've had a lot of conversations with my friends, and I've seen their own perspective change, and I've seen even small changes but start to develop into these greater things. And for me, that is just something that's really positive and really important to me and really changes my view and sees how my work and how the work that we've put in has made such a big difference on so many people. Even if you think it's so small, it can really have such a big impact on people. And always having these really small conversations can really build up and change someone's perspective and really better their life.
I think related to that, I know we talked a bit about like the pebble dropping into the pond, and what Gabriel just said reminded me of that. And as a reminder to people listening, your voice is kind of like a pebble dropping into a pond or spreading across the pond with emotion and with feeling that really has the capacity to inspire people and to inspire those waves that you'll see on the pond. So I think I agree with Gabriel. I think, it doesn't have to take something major like what Alex went through to experience this change. I think you just need to have conversations and have confidence in yourself and who you really are.
And if I think of one thing about the three of you, is you guys, the word that pops into my bubble first is courage. What I'm doing now didn't take courage. It took me getting hit on the side of my head by a 2x4 and I just reacted, right? And it was a survival instinct. And luckily, I was able to connect with the right elements to survive in a constructive way, right? Not a destructive way. But you guys, what you're doing is actually making these active, courageous decisions to put yourselves out there. And I applaud you for it. Using your voice is a superpower. But using your voice has to be practiced. And the one message I want to send to everyone out there is don't wait until a crisis to practice. You don't take an exam without studying dozens and dozens of hours, right? You don't go onto a sports field without hundreds of hours of practice, right, to perform your best. So practice with a friend. Have a conversation where you share some feelings with a buddy the next time that you're together. Or if you're around the dinner table with your parents, ask a question to your mom and dad. Make yourself vulnerable. Ask them how do they handle themselves in a particular situation. Share something personal with someone. Because the more you practice this, at those stressful moments when you see something that doesn't fit right with you and who you are as a person, it'll be so much easier to use your voice and help someone else. And that to me is the true mark of a superhero, is someone that understands who they are as a person and is not afraid to use their voice on behalf of themselves and others. And from that perspective, you guys are truly heroes, in my book. Because Hugh and Gabriel, I got to see the operating environment of your school, which is no different than, so many different schools. Yes, the difference is your school allows these conversations to come in. And I applaud any school that allows these conversations to be had within the four walls of the schools. And JP, one of your, advisors, we had a great conversation about the importance of having other voices coming in to the schools that are not just the teachers and the adults within the four walls, but to have other voices reinforcing, these messages. So I'm so grateful that we had the opportunity to come into Riverdale to speak. And I'm hoping other schools will invite us in for these conversations. And I'm actually hoping that we can do this podcast from inside of various schools to actually show and bring in other voices to have these conversations. So anyone listening to this, if you think this is important work, contact us. Ask us to come into your school. We will gladly do this. We will gladly engage with you. If you want to have a conversation with any of us, reach out to us. This is what we do every day. We're here to help you, and we're here to help you build that muscle memory that's so critical. And we understand the purpose of muscle memory, right? For sports, for academics. But as human beings that we are, we need to practice and to activate our voices. And I am always so grateful to be using our voices collectively, on this podcast. And I'm so grateful for you guys.
Yeah, and I would say one last closing message is always, always practice. And don't be afraid to take that first step. Take it right now. Right after this podcast ends, do it. Don't be afraid. It's always worth it.
Well, this is not a visual podcast, but I'm wearing a Georgetown, t-shirt. And I think for most of us of a certain age, when we heard the word practice, we default to Allen Iverson, who had the press conference where he berated a reporter saying, practice. We're here talking about practice. But what?
Not a game.
Not a game.
Not a game.
Exactly.
We're talking about practice.
Yes. So what people don't understand, though, is Allen Iverson was the hardest working professional basketball player ever. He was a man of small size who played a game with giants. And he had just been through a lot of difficult times and had flown back and was having this conference with the reporters after going through a lot. And the discussion was about him missing practice. And that was the context of him speaking about practice. And he wasn't relaying to it, I just show up to a game and perform. That's all that's needed. No, he was helping a friend in need. He was saying, we're here talking about practice when human life is what we should be talking about, right? And the whole clip of what he said was missed with this. But the whole clip is what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about human life. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about relationships. And that the practice of living is what's important. Because, in order to perform in a game, in real life, right, we have to live as we are, in order to perform as we are. And, I think that is something that, my experience at Georgetown, showed me, my experience at my school in New York, Browning School, who we're working with as well. All of these experiences that have shaped me, the things that I remember, are my times that I've connected with adults or my peers in a meaningful way. And I hope this experience with this podcast can reach other people, that someday they will be talking about the practice that we are doing with this podcast and we're asking others to do with us. So on that note, I want to thank our listeners. I want to thank Hugh and Gabriel for being the wonderful young men that you are. And for Ben, thank you for joining us, on the podcast and coming out from behind the microphone to share with us. And we're looking forward to more conversations with you. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.